Greetings, everyone, and welcome back to the Aldersgate Experience, the podcast of Aldersgate Church in York, Pennsylvania. I'm Pastor Bob Kaler.
And I'm Pastor Jeff Markey.
We are back after a week off where we had some vacation.
Yeah, you got some battlefield stuff going for you?
Was out on the battle walks for the Gettysburg 162nd anniversary.
Wow.
Out there nerding out with other Civil War nerds. And
well, I was going to be in a cabin in a lake, but that did not happen.
No, you had
a small lake in my house.
A small lake in your house. You brought it to you.
That's right. Clogged HVAC line, and that's the story.
Came through the
basically.
ceiling, and
oh yeah,
disaster.
It was well, and we were going to go on vacation on Sunday. It happened on Friday, so we were there. Had we not been there, it would have been a lot worse. So a crisis could have been a disaster. So a disaster was averted, but still
not a great way to spend your vacation.
No, I got a hole in my ceiling right now. So
well, we're praying for closure in many ways around that.
Every way, that's right.
Well, we're in the midst of a series on the 7 churches of Revelation, and we're calling this Postcards, Greetings from Patmos, Postcards to the Church.
Yeah.
And the first week we looked at Ephesus and the idea of loveless orthodoxy.
Yeah.
God
Speaking
says
truth, but in love is the important thing.
Yeah, right? Yeah. Jesus says to the church there in Ephesus, look, you're doing really well. Your doctrines are correct, but you've lost the love you had at first.
Yeah.
And so therefore you need to combine those two things together. We encourage you to go back and listen to that message. But this week we were in Smyrna, which is the next stop. If you're taking the trip around that circle of those 7 churches,
yeah,
you come to Smyrna. And
well, you spoke a lot about Polycarp this past week.
Yeah, Polycarp, of course, that story comes several decades after John is writing. But one of the reasons that I chose to incorporate that is because it's indicative of what Jesus says to the church there in Smyrna. John writes to them in the 80s AD that they're undergoing persecution. There will be more to come. And Polycarp is indicative of the fact that, yes, indeed, there is more to come. And he's going to bear the brunt of it. And the writing about him, the martyrdom of Polycarp, which is a 2nd century text, kind of opens the door for us to see what that looked like for people in Smyrna. You know, so often we read these letters, like we read the letters of Paul, we read these postcards to the church there in Revelation. We only get one side of the story. We don't get the other side of it. So one of the things I'm trying to do in this series is to provide some of the historical context that undergirds a lot of this symbolism.
So important.
And here in Smyrna, you know, the idea of persecution, what it means, what it looks like, what's the nature of it, the Polycarp story really brings that to the surface.
Really does. It really does. And I know what is this saying goes, those who don't learn their history are doomed to repeat it. But really, this Polycarp is a wonderful example of those who learn their history can actually walk in its footsteps in a positive way, in a healthy way, because obviously martyrdom isn't anything that anybody wants. But at the same point, being faithful to the call, that's tremendous, and that's important for us all, no matter what we're dealing with.
Yeah, and I think that's why this text is kind of timeless. I love Mark Twain's way of phrasing that. He says history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme.
Yeah.
It has similarities to it, and we've seen throughout Christian history how persecution has come and gone with the church, depending on who's in power. Of course, by the time you get to the 4th century, Constantine becomes the emperor, has this conversion experience, which is really he conquers under the sign of the cross. He has a vision, and so he decides the whole empire is going to become Christian. Things change relatively quickly from Christianity becoming this outlaw religion to suddenly become the religion of the empire. And some scholars would say that's when things really started to go sideways, because it began to adopt a lot of Roman convention in the midst of it.
Right.
But here in Revelation, we see this fledgling church, how they're running against Roman culture, but staying faithful to their convictions in the midst of heavy cultural pressure to conform. And I would argue, as I did in the sermon, that we're still under a lot of cultural pressure to conform.
Right.
The gods are maybe a little bit different, not that different really. They just have different names.
Right.
But But the cultural pressure to be a good citizen of this world versus being a citizen of the kingdom is still very, very real. So that makes it timeless. And I think Polycarp gives us a window kind of in between what John is writing and where we are today. He gives us sort of an example of what that looks like. And if you haven't listened to the sermon yet, Polycarp, 86 years old, he's ratted out as the Bishop of Smyrna. One of his servants is captured and tortured, gives up the fact that Polycarp's the bishop. And because he's 86, the Roman officials don't really want to execute him. They think he's going to die anyway pretty soon. Let's just avoid the spectacle and just let him die quietly. And so they come to him and they basically say, look, if you just put a little pinch of incense on the altar to honor Caesar, if you just honor our gods a little bit, we'll let you go. You can die peacefully. Polycarp's not having it. He will not compromise. And so they order him to be burned at the stake. And there's this great story. A lot of this is sainthood kind of hagiography, but he's put on the stake and they try to burn him, but there's a protection around him and everything burns but Polycarp. So they stab him instead and the blood runs out and puts the fire out. But at the same time, it's indicative of the fact that here's a man who's saying, no, I'm not going to compromise, even to the very end.
Yeah.
And that great quote, 86 years have I served him.
Absolutely.
And he's never done me any wrong. Why would I blaspheme my Lord and Savior? One of the great quotes of early Christian history.
Yes, it's very, very strong. How is the persecution faced by the early church in Smyrna? How would you say it's different, but also similar to what we would hear from the word persecution today, what we would expect from it?
Well, we tend to, here in the West, think of persecution more kind of as inconvenience in many ways.
Yeah.
You're not popular. People might say hateful things about you on social media. They might cancel you. They might do those kinds of things. But in other places in the world, this becomes much more real because for those who might be in a house church in China, for example, or in Myanmar or North Korea, there's a very real sense that they're in physical danger.
That's very true.
When they're worshiping God and worshiping Jesus Christ as Lord. So for them and for us thinking about them, this is an important text.
Yeah.
But persecution takes a lot of forms, from the very subtle, from the more cultural kind of persecution to real in-depth persecution. We have to be careful not to conflate the two.
Yeah, there's a huge difference.
But at the same time, to recognize the seeds are always there. And the pressure to conform culturally is always there. And so you may not be tempted to conform culturally to save your skin, but you might be in order to not be canceled on social media. So we have this kind of relativism in terms of persecution that we have to keep in mind.
I laugh, but it's sad because we really do have a hard time conflating those two dynamics. They're completely different. And the ideas that we have about I'm persecuted because, there's no holiday cups or there's no Christmas cups. There are holiday cups now.
People say happy holidays instead of Merry Christmas. Persecution. No.
We're really blessed if that's persecution.
That's all you have. No one's burning you at the stake.
No. You describe a moment where Polycarp told, say away with the atheists, and he responds by just gesturing to that crowd. What does that moment teach us about courage and even humor? I mean, it's humor at this point.
Well, of course, the early Christians in the Roman Empire are considered to be atheists because they don't worship the Roman gods and they don't worship Caesar. You see the constant repetition of the cult of the emperor here in Revelation in these cities, where the Roman emperors believe on some level that they're divine. I mean, we talked in the first sermon about Domitian, who minced these coins with pictures of his dead son sitting on of a globe surrounded by 7 stars.
Yes.
There's a sense of divinity around these emperors, and so they want to be worshipped. And if you don't worship these gods, because the gods are involved in all these different aspects of life, if you don't worship the Roman gods, the thinking goes, you're not being a good citizen, and the gods will be angry, and therefore things like natural disasters and floods and horror and plague and things like that will come upon us because you Christians are not playing ball. You're not worshiping our gods. And so when they come to Polycarp and say, essentially, you need to renounce your faith and say, away with the atheists, meaning you need to renounce your Christian community, who are all considered to be atheists by us because you don't believe in the Roman gods.
Right.
Instead, Polycarp points to the pagan Roman crowd and says, okay, away with the atheists, because they're the real atheists in Polycarp's mind, because they don't worship the true Lord and King of the world.
Yeah.
So a very different way of conceiving atheism in that sense. But I think what Polycarp is doing there is turning things back on them. I love this story because I'm getting older, and Polycarp at 86 is like, look, I'm about to die. There's no reason for me to be tactful here.
Yeah.
I'm just going to say it. And he basically right there, he says it. It's like, I've said this before, I don't know when I'm going to die, but I'm not going to hold back some stuff. Stuff needs to be said, and that's what he does there.
Yeah.
And I think there's some humor in that for us, but it's also a commentary on what he believes. Mm-hmm. And in the very end, too, he's trying to say, look, if you want to know about Christianity, I'll be glad to tell you all about it. Even when he's tied to the stake, they're about to light the fire. Hey, you might have a chance here to become a believer. That's boldness. That is incredible boldness.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you referenced Daniel and the 10 days of testing in the sermon. Talked about, vegetarians love this verse. They'll use it like it's their own gospel. What do you think? What do you think Jesus is communicating with that symbolic number?
Well, from a general sense, both Revelation and Daniel have a very close relationship. Mm-hmm. Daniel, the second part of Daniel, from Daniel 7 on, actually, Daniel 12, all those later, the later part of Daniel is very apocalyptic. It's the same kind of symbolic language that we read here in Revelation. So there's a lot of connection there. And what the writer of Revelation does here, what John does through this vision, and Jews reading this text would have picked that up right away. 10 days, the 10 days that are given to Daniel and his friends as a test. And so what Jesus is saying here essentially is you're going to undergo some testing. And we have to think about early Christian persecution not being one steady, continuous thing. It comes and goes.
Yeah.
It depends on who the emperor is, what their emphasis is. It comes and goes. And so I think what Jesus is saying here is, look, this particular period is going to be temporary. So endure in the midst of it. And there will be others to come, but it's a matter of staying the course, because it's going to get better and it's going to get worse. And so often, when things are riding high, I love, for example, reading things about the church.
Yeah.
So post-COVID, everything was awful, terrible, pastors quitting, nobody goes to church anymore. Now you read stuff and people say, look, there's this resurgence in the church in different places, and look at this hope. We go back and forth.
Ebbs and flows.
Swing the pendulum back and forth. And I think what Jesus is saying here to the church in Smyrna, and through them to us, look, you've got to stay the course. You've got to be consistent and clear about what you believe. And as Polycarp says, know who you are and what you're about.
Yeah.
And who you serve. That's the consistency that he's looking for all the way to the end.
It's necessary. I think when you talk about orthodoxy and being able to stay true to the faith, regardless of the cultural headwinds or tailwinds or whatever, is being able to stay the course and know who you are, so that when the time comes, you can have an answer for that.
Yeah,
that's awesome. What parallels do you see between the pressures of the church in Smyrna and maybe the pressures Christians face today in our Western context? We have parallels and we have differences as well.
Yeah,
obviously.
One of the things that happens here in Smyrna, and Jesus refers to it here, that the persecution can hit you in the wallet. Mm-hmm. It can also be slander. So poverty and slander, the two things that he talks about, are kind of the results of this affliction. And in Smyrna, as in many places in the ancient world, if you were a Christian metal worker, for example, and you wanted to work in the town, you had to join the guild. And the guild regulated prices, it made sure you were authorized, all those kinds of things. But those guilds, each one of those guilds had a patron god or goddess that needed to be honored. And so if you want to be part of the guild, you've got to honor that particular god or goddess. And of course, if you're a Christian, what do you do there? And a lot of times that honoring has to do with food sacrificed to idols. That becomes a big deal in the New Testament, or paying some kind of homage or incense or something like that. So if you're a Christian, you can't really do that. So how do you maintain your business? You might lose your business, but you might also be slandered. Again, the early Christians are called things like cannibals because they eat the flesh and drink the blood of their founder. Or they're considered to be incestuous because they give the kiss of peace to one another in their gatherings. So people on the outside are looking at these people and saying, look, they're very strange. And I think the parallels are true today too. You know, if you take a stand, for example, if you take a biblical stand on an issue, regardless of whether you're looking at an issue like sexuality or something, or if you're taking a stand on something like immigration, if somebody's against you, if somebody's opposed to you, they're going to hammer you. And now we're seeing social media being very much like that. It's just waiting to pounce.
Yeah.
You have to be very careful about what you post, because suddenly you could say, look, the sky is blue today, and someone could say, no, cancel that person because it's not really blue. It's a particulate of blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
People just, they troll for troll's sake. And
also the algorithms are set up to create division.
They create that kind of division.
Because it stirs engagement.
And so
that's good.
So the question is, how do you navigate in a world that runs against your values and stay faithful to Jesus in the midst of it, while still at the same time not cutting yourself off completely or denigrating your neighbors? And it's a fine line to walk, to state with conviction, like Polycarp does, look, I've served Jesus my whole life. I can't do anything else. This is my conviction, and to state where you are. This is very, Edwin Friedman talks a lot about this as self-differentiation, the idea that we state what we believe and we stay with that, but we don't do it in a nasty way. We do it in as winsome a way as possible. We give an account of our faith, as Paul says. We want to be able to speak the truth in love and to add salt and light rather than more division when we do that. So this is one of the things I think that Christians in the modern age have to really embrace, is an apologetics kind of approach, but one that is not so much about the doctrines of the faith, but rather why we believe what we believe and why we think it's the best way to live. Not forcing everybody else to live that way, but saying, look, this is how we believe the best way to live is. Now, you can live however you like. No one's telling you can't. It's a free country. Do what you like. But this is why we do what we do. Well,
yeah, we create the example and be able to say it in a peaceable way. But we don't need to be defensive about it either, right? I mean, we don't want to be offensive, obviously. The gospel itself is offensive to some.
Yeah, I mean, and our world's a little bit different. I mean, in the Roman world, there's a lot more pressure to conform because, one, you're the minority. Two, you've got to honor these gods, and if you don't,
it wasn't just social
consequences.
Right. It wasn't just social consequences. You mentioned, literal homes, family, lands taken away. Yeah, there's a lot at stake dealing with that type of persecution.
And I think we have to be prepared to pay the price sometimes when you run against the grain. Yeah. And you're going to do that. As I said on Sunday, if you're a Christian, you're never going to fit completely into a paradigm that the world's going to say, great.
Yeah.
You're all it. You're just never going to do that because you're always going to run afoul of someone's issue.
Absolutely.
Because
And
you're focused on the issues of the kingdom, and the values are very different.
Right. The kingdom of God versus the kingdom of man. And we have all these types of idols that we lift up, and that's what this whole book is about. So you mentioned that only Smyrna and Philadelphia were praised without criticism in Revelation. So what can churches today learn from Smyrna and Philadelphia?
Stay consistent. I think, to me, that's the biggest thing. I was listening to a podcast recently. A guy had written a book on ecclesiology, which is kind of the study of the church. And he was talking about different forms of ecclesiology. Like, where does your understanding of the church emerge from? Does it emerge from the scripture? Does it emerge from the classic understanding of the church throughout time and history? And that has not a straight line history. It meanders quite a bit.
Absolutely.
From the early church to the Roman church to Eastern Orthodoxy to the Reformation, all those kinds of things. It's more like a tree rather than a river.
Yeah,
It branches a lot.
Makes a
but
lot
there's
of sense.
but there's a consistent thread of orthodoxy that runs through there. Or is your conception of the church primarily based in human experience? Like, we believe, human beings, well, we've seen human beings change and shift, so therefore we need to change and adapt the church to fit what human beings now believe about certain things. Two very different ecclesiologies.
Very different.
And I think what Jesus is saying to these churches is, look, you've chosen the right path. You've chosen to stay faithful to me and my conception of what the church is, and not given into where the cultural wind blows. Paul talks about this, if you're not consistent, you'll be blown to and fro by every wind of doctrine. And there are some Christian groups that essentially, they stick their finger up in the wind and see where the cultural wind is blowing, and we're going to go wherever that goes. But what Jesus is saying to these two churches is, you've stayed the course. Despite persecution, despite paying the price for that, you're to be commended for those things. So Smyrna and Philadelphia both get that, but the other churches all have issues because they're being pulled and pushed to have a more human-centered ecclesiology, and Jesus is basically saying, no, this is the way.
Yeah, and it makes total sense because we can learn from both the mistakes, as we're going to see in the other letters, both from the mistakes of the churches as well as these wonderful examples that do stay that course. So you ended with Polycarp's final witness. I am a Christian. If you wish to learn what the doctrines of Christianity are, appoint me a day and you shall hear them. So how can we recover that kind of bold and gracious witness?
I think first we have to understand what the doctrines of Christianity are.
Yeah.
I think there needs to be, in order for us to lock down what it means to be the church, we have to be very solid on our doctrine. Ephesus, solid on doctrine. It has to be tempered with that idea of love. Now, I would argue, as I think Jesus argues, well, I know he does, love is the undergirding of all that doctrine.
Absolutely.
But knowing what you believe is absolutely essential. And I think one of the problems we've had in a lot of modern Christianity is we've laid back on doctrine, and we've kind of talked more about, well, it's just about love, and it's more of a Beatles kind of thing. All you need is love. And what is the characteristic of that love? Well, that's formed by what we believe about who God is, the author of love.
Yeah, you closed talking about the idols of emotivism and kind of some generalities instead of really honing in on what those majors are.
Yeah, we're going to talk some about that this week when we get into the church at Pergamum, about how our cultural values have been shifted and changed by philosophers over the course of centuries. That there are philosophers who are long dead. Think Nietzsche, Freud, Kant, people like that, who have influenced Western culture so much to the point at which it's like the water that we swim in. we don't even know it's around us. But this idea of individualism and what constitutes human flourishing, all of that comes out of a lot of post-Enlightenment Western philosophy, which really runs counter to the biblical vision of the kingdom and things like that. So what we've got to do is first of all, help people to understand what we actually believe about humanity, about God, about the purpose of life, and contrast that with how culture has assumed that. There's kind of Tom Holland in his work on his great book Dominion on how Christianity influenced the West.
Wow.
Really fascinating book about how Christian values are part of Western culture, even for those who might be atheists. The idea of equality and things like that are all Christian values. The Roman world didn't have those values.
No.
Christianity brought them in.
Yeah.
But now we have a culture that desires to have Christian values, but without the underpinning of actual
Doctrine.
Christianity.
Yeah.
So when you have that, now you have these doctrines, these ideas that have gone rogue and been applied more to the individual, been applied more to my own idea of human flourishing. So we'll talk about that some this week.
Wow.
But I think really understanding what we believe, and it's always amazed me, so many churches are weak on catechesis that our people can't articulate what they really are supposed to believe.
Yeah.
What Christianity really is. And I think that's where revival and renaissance is going to happen, when we go back to the basics. And we've been doing that. We had a series this past fall on the creed. We're going to do another series this fall on sort of our Wesleyan distinctives.
That's exciting.
And our theological grounding and things like that, so that people have a base from which to work. Because otherwise we get caricatures of Christianity. We get secularized versions of Christianity rather than the authentic thing.
Yeah.
And in order for the church to really be consistent, it's going to need that foundation to be laid.
What you just said, it's going to need it, right? It's a necessity.
It's repointing all the stones of that foundation.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you. This is a wonderful, wonderful dive into Smyrna and all these challenges that we face. There's so much application, both for the individual and for the collective church.
Yeah.
So much for it. So looking forward to next week.
Yeah, we'll be getting into the church at Pergamum. So if you want to read ahead, that's in Revelation chapter 2, beginning at verse 12. Awesome. And we'll be looking at that this coming week. And as always, you can send us your questions and comments.
Yep, you can email us at communications@aldersgateyork.com. You can also just submit something below, comment, question. We're happy to submit those on YouTube as well. Please like and share this video if you find it helpful, or if you want to send it along to somebody who might be interested in learning more about Smyrna and the seven churches of Revelation.
You can catch all those sermons on our Aldersgate York YouTube page. You can look at them there. You can find back episodes of the podcast on some other things that we're doing. So we hope that you'll check that out, and we hope you'll join us next time right here on the Aldersgate Experience.
God bless.